Fasta and Lukky. Red wunz go Fasta, blue ones is Lukky. Da gods never said what happens when they race. Part 1. Da bet. The argument started in Grimzod's workshop, the way most big things start, over something small, with a wrench already in somebody's hand. Vroomtoof had brought Da Screama in for a tune, not because anything was wrong with it, but because there was a difference between fast and fastest, and he intended to spend his whole life on the correct side of it. Lugnutz's Deff Dread stood in the next bay, where it had stood for a week, waiting on a knee-bearing. Neither of them had planned to be there at the same time. Grimzod would later charge both of them for the wasted afternoon. It began with Vroomtoof pointing out, helpfully, at volume, that the Dread had been in the shop so long it was less of a customer and more of a wall. "It ain't slow," said Lugnutz. "It's waitin'." "Waitin' is slow," said Vroomtoof. "Waitin' is the slowest thing there is. You know what never waits. Fast is already there." Lugnutz thought about this for exactly as long as it took Grimzod to seat the new bearing. "Fast gets there," he agreed. "Lukky gets the good bits on day way." Grimzod, who had tuned red engines and painted blue hulls his whole working life, and privately took teeth from both sorts, made the mistake of laughing. Vroomtoof demanded to know what was funny. Lugnutz put his hand back on his dread, and the question, fast or Lukky, which one did the gods actually back, walked out of the workshop by dinner time, and went through the camp like a grot with a lit stick bomb. By the second day, the camp had divided into a red half and a blue half. By the third day, there had been 11 separate brawls about it, 2 of them excellent, and the local war boss, who was trying to run the supply end of a speed war, and did not have time for 11 brawls a day in his own scrapyard, declared that the matter would be settled the proper way. A race. The mountains stood east of the camp, like a row of bad teeth, the last wall of rock between the ash wastes and the far valleys, 40 kilometers of gorges, switchbacks, and roads that had been built by humies and improved by nobody. First one out the other side, at the old Humie way station on the eastern flats, won the pot, and the pot, by the time the bookies had finished with the camp, was a war chest, 600 teeth, 3 squigs, a slightly cursed bionic arm, and somebody's truck that they were going to be very angry about later. The rules were agreed in front of witnesses, which is to say, shouted until nobody could remember disagreeing. Rule 1. The vehicle must get there with its owner. Rule 2. The vehicle must not fall apart on dayway. Arriving in more than one piece was arriving as more than one vehicle, and that was cheating. Rule 3. No Krumpin da Uber racer. Krumpin was for afterwards, as a celebration. Vroomtoof brought Da Screama to the line as the sun came up red through the ash. The Screama was a Shokkjump Dragsta, and it was beautiful in the way that only a machine built around a gun, an engine, and a piece of stolen teleporter could be beautiful. Every panel of it was red. The panels underneath the red panels were also red. Vroomtoof had once caught a grot priming a wing with grey undercoat, and had thrown the grot, the undercoat, and, after some thought, the wing off a cliff, because speed was not something you compromised on in layers. "Look at it," he said to the crowd, because Vroomtoof narrated his own machine, the way other orcs narrated their kills. "Dat is the fastest thing on dis planet, what ain't already left." Lugnuts brought his Deff Dread to the line by walking it there, slowly, which took long enough that the bookies opened a side market on whether he'd arrive before the race began. The Dread was blue. It was blue the way the deep sea is wet, completely, and with a suggestion that it had always been that way, and always would be. Lukky blue, Deathskull blue, painted and repainted until the luck had soaked into the metal like grease. Bolted to its hull were the souvenirs of a long career of finding things. A Humy tank hatch, half a road sign, a bell of unknown origin, and a boot. Lugnut stood in the pilot's cage and looked at the mountains. "Nice day," he said, "for walkin'." He was a Deathskull of the old pattern, was Lugnut's, and he spoke the way his dread moved, one word at a time, each one placed carefully, as if words were also things that might be worth keeping. Above the starting line, in a Defkopta that still had another orc's name painted on it, hovered the judge. Nizzle de Tallygrot was the most honest scorekeeper on Armageddon, and everyone knew this because he had taken bribes from both camps of exactly the same size, which cancelled out. He clung to his slate with one hand and a chalk with the other, and screamed the rules over the rotor noise in his official voice, which was like a regular grot voice, but with more spit.
"By the power what is invested in me,"
Nizzle shrieked.
"on account of everyone paying me, this race is official. First one to the way station wins. Ready."
Vroomtoof revved. The Skriama's engine went from growl to shriek, to a sound like the sky tearing. Lugnuts did not rev, because legs don't.
"Steady!"
"Oi, Lugnuts!" Vroomtoof called across the line, grinning with all his teeth. "Want me to carve your name into finish post, save you the bother of getting there?" Lugnuts considered this. "You spelt it wrong," he said. "Last time."
"Go!"
screamed Nizzle. Vroomtoof slammed the Shokkjump lever, which was the Screama's finest feature, a rip in the world, borrowed from a shock attack gun and pointed forwards, that hurled the whole buggy through nowhere and out the other side, kilometers ahead, faster than anything with wheels had a right to be. That was the theory. In his excitement, Vroomtoof had the gearbox in reverse. There was a green flash and a sound like the universe hiccuping. Da Screama vanished from the starting line and reappeared 2 kilometers behind it, backwards, in the middle of the bookies' tents, still doing 140. Vroomtoof spent a short, educational period of time watching the race recede in front of him while traveling away from it. The teleporter field, having thrown the dragsta one way, shoved everything near the start line the other, and the nearest large object was a blue Deff Dread. Lugnuts felt the world hum, and then the ground was sliding beneath him, and then he was standing a full kilometer up the mountain road without having taken a step, souvenirs rattling. He looked down at his legs, which had not moved. He looked back at the camp, where a red dot was extracting itself from a tent, from a second tent, and from a bookmaker's entire physical business. "Thanks," said Lugnuts to nobody in particular, and started walking. Overhead, Nizzle made a chalk mark on his slate. It was the first of many. Part 2. Up. To Vroomtoof's credit, and he awarded himself this credit out loud, at volume while doing it, he made the lost ground back in under 4 minutes. The lower slopes were his country, long straights of cracked hummy road, rising through the foothills in lazy sweeps, and the screamer ate them. This was the thing the blue-painted gits never understood. Speed wasn't a way of getting places. Speed was the place. Somewhere past the point where the wind stopped being air and became a fist, there was a moment when the engine and the road and Vroomtoof's own heartbeat locked together into a single roaring note. And in that moment, he was fairly sure Gork could see him personally. He caught the dread at the first bend, and went past it so fast that the shockwave rang Lugnuts' souvenirs like a wind chime. Then, because winning was nothing if nobody watched you do it, he turned and came back. Overtake number 1 was performed 3 times in circles. The screamer howled around the walking dread once, twice, 3 times, close enough to strip paint. Blue paint, sacrilege, he'd apologize to nobody. While Vroomtoof stood up in the driver's seat and told Lugnuts exactly what he thought of luck, with both hands.
"That's 1!"
screamed Nizzle from above, chalk flying.
1 overtake free! Free spinny bits, it's all going on to slate!
Lugnuts walked through the middle of the spectacle at exactly the pace he had been walking before it. He was watching the road and the mountain and a rock ahead that looked loose enough to be worth stepping around. When the red blur finally straightened out and screamed off up the pass, he raised one arm. The mountain silence rolled back in behind the engine noise like water, and gave it a small, unhurried wave. Then came the serpentines, and the mountain had opinions. The road up the pass had been cut by humies for humie machines, ore haulers, crawlers, things with brakes and patience. It folded back on itself in tight-stacked hairpins, each one a shelf over a longer drop, and it had never in its existence met anything like Da Screamer. Vroomtoof took the first hairpin at full speed on the principle that all problems could be outrun. The Screamer left the road, traveled some distance through the air in a dignified straight line, and came down on the hairpin below, the one he'd already done. He took it again. He left the road again. On the third attempt, he clipped the inside wall, spun twice, and came to rest facing downhill, which he took as the mountain's opening offer in a negotiation. The problem, he decided, was obvious. The corners were too slow for him. The solution, according to everyone who had ever built a road, was to also go slow. And Vroomtoof tried. He truly, honestly tried, for what he would later describe as the longest 4 seconds of his life. He held the Screamer down to a crawl, a walking pace, an obscenity, and his right leg, which had been raised in the cult of speed since before it could kick, pressed the pedal flat all by itself the moment his brain looked away. It wasn't disobedience, it was the cult of speed, and the leg was a truer believer than the orc it was bolted to. You could not ask an Evil Sunz leg to go slow, any more than you could ask a fire to be cold, and every time the engine note dropped below a scream, something deep in Vroomtuff's chest informed him that he was dying. So he went fast, and crashed, and reversed, and went fast, and crashed, the same hairpin 6 times. He named it. It had a name now, and the name was not repeatable in front of grots. Lugnuts, meanwhile, had looked at the serpentines from the bottom, followed the road with his eye as it zigzagged up the face, and then looked at the face itself, which went straight up. "Roads," he said, "is for wheels." The Dread put one piston foot on the 40-degree slope and began to climb, ignoring the entire argument. Scree slid. The Dread didn't. Boulders shifted. The Dread stepped on them until they stopped. It cut across the first switchback, then the second, walking a straight line up a mountain, the way other things walked across a floor, and somewhere around the fourth, crossing its shadow, fell over a red buggy that was reversing out of a rock wall with smoke coming off the tires. Lugnuts did not spin around him in circles. He did not shout or gesture or blow his horn on account of not having one. He simply walked across the road 2 meters in front of the screamer's nose, one souvenir clanking against another, and carried on up the cliff. It was the politest thing anyone had ever done to Vroomtuff, and he screamed about it for a full minute.
"That's one for the blue one!"
Nizzle shrieked overhead, hanging out of the deaf copter at an angle that would have worried a grot with more to live for.
"One each. This is what we in the judging business calls a proper race."
They reached the top of the pass within sight of each other. The screamer by conquering the final hairpin on the 9th attempt through what could only be called attrition. The Dread by stepping over the crash barrier from the wrong side of it. And there they both stopped, because of the view. The eastern side of the range fell away beneath them in folds of gray and rust, down to a valley floor smoky with distance. There were humour mines down there, whole hillsides gnawed open, with ore belts crawling between them like tendons. There was a road on the valley floor, with a refugee column on it, 10 kilometers of trucks and walkers and dust. There were gun flashes along the horizon, where the speed war was eating a defense line, and columns of smoke standing over burning somethings, and, high and far off, the little sparks of aircraft hunting each other through the haze. "Look at dat," breathed Vroomtuff. "Look at all dat war." It was, both of them agreed without saying so, a lovely view. Orcs are not sentimental about many things, but a landscape with sufficient fires in it will make even a speed freak go quiet for a moment. Lugnutz's eye followed the valley floor, and the mines, and the fighting. All of it, he noted, a long way from the straight line he'd be walking. The Red Git would probably get to fight half of it. The Red Git got to fight everything. Things happened to Vroomtuff. Things had never once happened to Lugnuts, except good ones, which didn't count. "Some orcs," he said, mostly to his Dread, "have all the luck." He did not notice anything wrong with the sentence, and began the climb down. Part 3. Down. The eastern serpentines were steeper, tighter, and, Vroomtoof discovered with a howl of joy, downhill, which meant gravity had finally joined his team. He took the first 3 hairpins in one continuous 4-wheel drift, engine at full shriek, and the mountain rang with it. The sound bounced from wall to wall of the pass, doubled, trebled, became a physical thing. A red noise hammering at ledges of old snow ash and shattered rock that had been waiting patiently for one good excuse. High above the road, a cornice the size of a battle wagon said, in effect, "Fair enough." Lugnut's was 2 switchback widths below, cutting his usual straight line down the slope, when the mountainside above him let go. He heard it before he saw it. A crack, a hiss, and then a growing roar that even he could tell was not an engine. He looked up into a wall of rock and gray ash, coming down at him with the mass of a landing rock. There was no time to get clear, so Lugnuts did what Deathskulls do in all situations where luck is the only plan remaining, which is most of them. He planted his feet shoulder width, bent the Dread's knees, and waited to see what the blue paint had to say about it. The avalanche took him like a wave takes a champion. The Dread's feet bit into the moving slab, skated, held, and then Lugnuts was riding it, surfing 3,000 tons of mountain down the slope, knees flexing, souvenirs streaming, the bell of unknown origin ringing madly, while the whole eastern face of the pass thundered down into the valley beneath him. He crossed the second switchback, airborne. He crossed the third in a standing crouch that a storm boy would have wept at. The avalanche carried him down past hairpin after hairpin, 3 kilometers of racing line in 40 seconds, and set him down at the bottom of the pass on a fresh fan of rubble, upright, facing the right direction, with 1 additional boulder balanced on his hull, which he decided to keep.
Why?
Screamed Nizzle from the deaf copter, scribbling so hard the chalk snapped.
Am I even supposed to write for that?
Lugnuts stepped off the debris, gave his knees a moment, and resumed walking. His heart was going. He'd admit that. His heart was going like anything. "Nothing ever happens to me," he sighed, and clanked east. Uphill, the situation was different. Vroomtoof came around the 4th hairpin into a wall. The avalanche had not been polite enough to miss the road. It had buried the whole eastern descent, hairpin after hairpin, under rock in slabs the size of killer cans. Duskrima skidded to a halt with its front tires touching the rubble, engine idling in disbelief. He tried the obvious answer first. The Shokkjump could throw the buggy clean over the whole mess, over the rubble, down the slope, back onto the flats. All the teleporter needed was speed. Proper speed, the kind that convinced the whole in the world you were serious. And there was no room to get it. The hairpins were too short. He backed up to the top of the section and floored it, and hit the rubble wall at what the Shokkjump's grot-built gauge insultingly described as not enough. He tried the section above that. Not enough. He tried taking 2 hairpins in one run and left the road entirely and spent some time in a gully. An orc who thought like a humie would have despaired. Vroomtoof thought like an Evil Sunz, which meant the answer was already obvious and merely hateful. If the way forward was blocked, he'd go back and around, All the way back, over the pass, down the western serpentines, out to the flats, and around the whole Zoggin mountain range by the southern canyons. The return journey was the fastest anyone had ever crossed those mountains, fueled entirely by rage. He crested the pass without slowing. He descended the western switchbacks he'd once needed 9 attempts for, in a single continuous scream, and when he shot out of the foothills onto the flats, there ahead of him were the tents of the starting camp, where the bookies saw a red dot growing on the horizon, and drew the only conclusion available. The cheer could be heard from the pass. "He's back!" they roared, as Da Screama tore through the camp at full throttle, its owner's face a rictus of concentrated fury. "He came back for more bets. What a sportsman! Double or nothing. Get your teeth down, lads. The red one's going round again." Somebody threw a celebratory stick bomb. Somebody else tried to place a bet on the Screama itself as it passed, physically, by throwing teeth into the cockpit. Vroomtoof did not stop to correct anyone's understanding of events. He swung south, found the mouth of the canyon country, and vanished into it, trailing dust and blasphemy. On his slate, hanging in the sky, Nizzle recorded the event, with the professional detachment of a grot being paid by everyone. 1 mark in the column he privately called fast. It was quite a big column now. Then he looked east, where a blue speck was crossing the valley floor at walking pace, dead on course, and licked his chalk. Part 4. Round. The southern canyons were fast country, hard flat floors, walls like gun barrels, and Vroomtoof made war on them. He also made 3 navigational discoveries. The first discovery was a junction where the old Humi signs had been helpfully repainted. The local grots, a feral warren of them, living in the canyon caves, who had heard about the race from a passing bookie, and had, to a grot, put everything they owned on the blue one, had turned the sign for the eastern flats to point up a side canyon, and improved it with glyphs reading, "This way, fast 1. Vroomtoof, doing 200, respected the sign. The side canyon narrowed, wandered, developed a floor of loose scree, and ended, 4 kilometers in, at a cliff face on which the same artists had painted, in enormous letters, "Ha, ha, ha, ha." The echo of what Vroomtoof said to that cliff caused minor rockfalls in 3 adjacent canyons, and the feral grot sold tickets to it for a week afterwards. The second discovery, after he'd retraced the 4 kilometers and taken the correct branch, was that the canyon ahead was already occupied. He came around a long bend into the tail of a Humi evacuation convoy. Trucks, half-tracks, families of the soft ones packed under tarpaulins, and a rearguard of proper soldiers with an armored car. All of it crawling east through the narrows at the pace of the slowest axle. A Humi officer saw a red buggy materialize in his mirror, doing 200, and made a command decision, involving every gun the rearguard had. What followed was, Vroomtoof would maintain for the rest of his life, the only good hour of the entire race. The Screama danced. Lasfire crackled off the canyon walls. The armored car chased him and clipped a boulder trying to match his line. He shock-jumped clean over the middle of the column and came down firing the custom shock rifle at the rear guard, who deserved it on account of being the only gits on this whole mountain range polite enough to shoot at him. By the time the convoy's escort had been reduced to scrap and the trucks were scattering east in panic, an hour was gone. The screamer's left wing was ventilated, and Vroomtof was grinning so wide his face hurt. "Dat!" he bellowed at the burning armored car, by way of a review. "Was the only good bit so far." Then he remembered. He was losing, and the grin died, and the engine screamed, and he was gone. The third discovery could wait, because at that moment, out on the valley floor, Lugnuts was having an experience. He had been crossing the mine country, walking the straight line between two of the great terraced pits, minding his own business as aggressively as ever, when the ground offered him a cable. It was a good thick humour power cable, mostly buried, and precisely 1 boot's width of it stood proud of the dirt at precisely the angle required. The Dread's left foot found it. Physics did the rest. Lugnuts went over the lip of the cutting like a felled gargant, rolled twice down a slope of tailings in an avalanche of his own souvenirs, and landed flat, square, and with a boom that echoed round the pit, on the moving ore belt of excavation site Delta 9. The belt was 3 dreads wide, built to carry a rolling mountain of crushed rock from the pits to the eastern railhead, and it did not stop for anything, because the machine spirits that ran it had not been consulted about the war, and were not taking questions. It registered the arrival of 11 additional tons of Deff Dread, adjusted its torque, and carried on east at a steady, humming, glorious 30 kilometers an hour. Lugnuts lay on his back on a river of ore and watched the canyon walls of the cutting slide past. Then he sat the Dread up, arranged his legs out in front of him, and rode. The belt ran past the mine's Hume crews on their gantries, and Lugnuts waved at every single one of them. A slow, courteous, hydraulic wave, boulder still balanced on his hull. And 40 vergs of Armageddon miners stood absolutely still and let the enormous blue passenger go by, on the professional understanding that anything that got between a Deathskull and wherever it was going became part of the journey. One of them, frozen on a ladder, was wearing a fine yellow work helmet with a little lamp on it, and as the belt carried Lugnuts past at eye level, he reached out, gently, the way you'd pick a fruit, and took it off the Hume's head and bolted it to his hull between the bell and the boot, without ever quite stopping his wave. He rode the ore 12 kilometers. It was, he reflected, the sort of thing that never happened to him. Nothing ever happened to him. He'd tripped over, was all, and now the mountain was carrying him east, while the Red One was off somewhere over the horizon having gunfights. He could hear them. That was the worst of it. The valley walls brought him the far-off crackle of loss fire and the unmistakable daka of a custom shock rifle, and every burst of it landed on Lugnuts's heart like rain on a window he was locked behind. Somewhere out there, gits were queuing up to shoot at Vroomtof. Nobody had ever once queued up to shoot at Lugnuts. He'd been in wars, obviously. He'd crumped his share. But things came to Vroomtof, and Lugnuts's things ran off before he arrived, or fell over, or turned out to be already on fire. Save some. He muttered eastward in the direction of the gunfire. Greedy git. The belt ended at the railhead. Lugnut stepped off onto solid ground, thanked the machinery with a pat that dented it, and resumed walking, and walked directly into the day's one genuine obstacle. The road east passed through a tunnel under a ridge spur, and the tunnel had been dropped. Humour engineering charges, old ones, the ceiling brought down in a plug of rock 50 meters deep. No way over the spur. No way around before nightfall. Lugnut looked at the rockfall. He flexed his claw, which was a good claw, but 50 meters was 50 meters. It was at this point that a Humour vulture gunship, prowling the valley for exactly his sort of silhouette, dropped out of the smoke haze and acquired him. Lugnut turned to face it, and felt something he had almost never felt. Hope. A proper flying gunship, guns and rockets and everything, all for him. He raised his claw in what he intended as both a challenge and a sincere welcome. The vulture's first rocket salvo missed him by 11 meters, struck the rockfall dead center, and blew the tunnel open. The overpressure knocked the plug of shattered rock loose down its whole length. Daylight appeared at the far end in a boiling cloud of dust. The vulture, its pilot evidently deciding that whatever was happening down there was now an engineering matter, banked away into the haze, and did not return. Lugnut stood in front of the open tunnel for some time. "Come back," he said, quietly, to the empty sky. It did not come back. Even the gits who shot at him didn't mean it. He was still saying it, more or less, 20 minutes later on the far side of the spur, when the whole eastern sky lit white. Somewhere high above the haze, a Humour ship was trying to buy its refugee columns time, and the valley shook as the orbital rounds came down along the orc axis of advance. A line of new suns marching across the flats, each one a fist from beyond the sky. The fourth round landed close. The blast picked the Dread up whole, souvenirs, boulder, helmet, and all, and threw it over the dry ravine that cut the flats in half, the one the road took 6 kilometers to get around, and set it down on the far bank in a crater of its own making, upright, facing east, ears ringing like the bell of unknown origin. Lugnut checked his legs, present. He checked his souvenirs, present plus crater. "Typical," he said, with feeling, and walked on. Behind him, to the south, a red streak came howling out of the canyon mouths onto the flats, found the road, and began to eat the distance between them. Vroomtoof had lost the signs, the convoy, the gully, and the better part of the afternoon, and he had promised the Skriama's engine, out loud, that they were never going slower than this again, as long as they both should live. He caught Lugnut's at the ravine road, 6 kilometers from the finish. Overtake number 2 got 7 full circles, 7 howling, tire-smoking laps around the walking Dread, 1 for every hour of the race so far, while Nizzle's chalk clattered on the slate overhead. Lugnut walked through the middle of the red whirlwind without turning his head, which cost Vroomtoof more than the avalanche had. And 2 kilometers later, with the way station's rooftop actually in sight on the horizon, something in Vroomtoof, some final load-bearing rivet of self-restraint, let go entirely, and he committed to the masterpiece. Overtake number 3 was not an overtake, it was an opera. He circled the Dread at full lock, engine bouncing off the limiter, close enough that the wind of his passing polished the blue armor. And he kept going. Around and around, tighter and faster, a red planet orbiting a blue sun, screaming into the dust cloud of his own making. That this right here was what fast looked like.
That's 5!
Shrieked Nizzle from above, hanging out of the Deathskulls by 1 foot, counting circles in real time, which was the hardest mathematics of his career.
6, 7, hang on, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17.
There was a pause at the outer limit of grot arithmetic.
Loads!
Nizzle screamed triumphantly and wrote it down.
17 and loads!
The screamer straightened out of its final orbit and shot away east down the arrow-straight final road, and Vroomtoof's laughter hung in the dust behind it. The fuel gauge had been sitting on its stop for some time. Vroomtoof had not looked at it because gauges were humour suspicion bolted onto proppa engineering, and because red wunz did not need counting, and because deep down, at speed, on a straight, with the finish in sight, Vroomtoof was not entirely convinced that fuel was real. Part 5. Da finish. The last 6 kilometers ran flat and straight and empty to the way station, and for 4 of them, Vroomtoof was immortal. This was the moment the whole race had been for. No corners, no mountains, no lying signs, no rubble, nothing left between him and the line but distance, and distance was the one enemy Vroomtoof had never lost to. The screamer's note rose and rose, ash streaming off the road behind him like a red comet's tail, and he stood half out of the seat into the wind and let it hammer him, and knew, with the whole of his simple burning heart, that the gods loved him, and always had. "Nothing," he informed the planet Armageddon, "can stop me, Ann." The engine coughed. It was a small cough, a polite cough, the cough of a machine that has been meaning to bring something up for a while. "No," said Vroomtoof. The engine coughed again, longer, and the note under him, the sacred note, the one that lived in his chest, sagged, staggered, caught, sagged again. "No, no, 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 no!" The screamer's engine ran dry 2 kilometers from the line, wound down through every register of dying, and stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Vroomtoof had ever heard. The buggy rolled and rolled, slower and slower, mocking him with each meter, and came to rest in the exact geometric middle of the road, pointing at the finish, in sight of the finish, with the wind ticking the cooling exhausts. Vroomtoof sat in the silence. He checked the fuel gauge, which said what fuel gauges say. He hit the fuel gauge, he tried the Shokkjump lever, and the teleporter, which fed off the main engine, because of course it did. He'd routed it that way himself for weight. Gave him one small green fizzle, like a dying squig's last insult. He looked at the finish line. He looked at the rules, which were carved into his memory in the shouts of witnesses. "Da vehicle must get there with its owner." Rules were rules. The bet was sacred. There was not an orc on Armageddon who would break the terms of a proppa bet, because a bet was a fight you had with words, and you did not run from fights. Vroomtoof climbed out of Darskrima, walked to the back of it, planted his hands on the rear cowling, dug his boots into the ash, and began to push. It was at this point, from far behind him, that he heard the footsteps. They were unhurried footsteps. They had all day. They came up the long straight at the same pace they had come. Over a mountain, down an avalanche, along an ore belt, and out of a crater. Boom, and then boom, and then, after an insolent little while, boom. Vroomtoof pushed. Orcs are strong, and speed freaks are stubborn, and the screamer began to roll. A meter, another meter, wheels crunching, while sweat cut channels through the ash on his arms, and the footsteps behind him grew no faster and no slower, and nothing in the world would make them do either. The blue shadow fell across him at 1.5 kilometers from the line. Lugnuts drew alongside, and this was the cruelty, this was the artistry, matched his pace to the rolling dragsta, and walked beside him. For 9 entire steps, the fastest orc in the mountains and the luckiest orc on the flats traveled the road east together at the speed of one Evil Sunz pushing. "Nice day," said Lugnuts, "for walkin'." Vroomtoof's reply was the longest, loudest, and most detailed opinion on luck ever delivered on Armageddon, and Nizzle, overhead, wrote down as much of it as he could spell. And as the dread finally pulled ahead, its claw dipped, casually, without breaking stride, the way you'd pick a fruit, and there was a small shriek of shearing bolts, and Daskrima's rear spoiler, the flame-painted one, the one Vroomtoof had personally angled for maximum fast, departed the vehicle and took up its new position, clamped under a blue arm, between the boulder and the Humy helmet. "Souvenir," Lugnuts explained, and walked on. The way station finish line had drawn a crowd, bookies who'd flown ahead, feral grots up from the canyons, a mob of off-duty tank bustas, and one entire warren of mine grots gone mad with impending wealth. They saw the blue dread come up the last kilometer with the sun behind it, souvenirs swinging, spoiler gleaming, and the roar started early and rolled out to meet him. Lugnuts crossed the line at walking pace, boom, 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 and stopped, and the race was over, or nearly. "Objection!" screamed a Red Faction bookie, scrambling onto a fuel drum. "The rule says the vehicle can't fall apart. Look at it. Dat thing's got more bits than it started with. A bell, a boulder, a helmet. Alpha spoiler what is probably red property. Dat ain't the same dread what left the camp. That's a different bigger dread, and the bigger dread never entered the race." The crowd went quiet with the joy of a proper legal crisis. All eyes went up to the Defkopta and the judge. Nizzle descended with terrible ceremony, slate under one arm. He walked around the dread once, counting souvenirs on his fingers until he ran out of fingers. He consulted the slate. He consulted his other slate, the small one, where his bribes were tallied, and confirmed that both columns were still exactly equal, and that he was therefore still the most honest grot on the planet.
"Da rule,"
Nizzle pronounced in his official voice.
Says a vehicle what arrives in more pieces than one has fallen apart. This vehicle, and he smacked the Dread's leg armor, has arrived in more vehicle than it started. That ain't falling apart. That's the opposite of falling apart. Any get what for the rules was against getting richer on the way?
He paused with real contempt.
I ain't thinked about what rules is for.
The roar settled it. The pot was Lugnuts's, 600 teeth, 3 squigs, a cursed bionic arm, and somebody's truck changed hands in a landslide, and somewhere in the canyons a warren of feral grots became, briefly, the richest grots in the hemisphere. Vroomtoof arrived 11 minutes later, still pushing, finished the race as per the rules, parked Da Screama over the line, and sat down on the spoilerless rear cowling with his elbows on his knees. Lugnuts clanked over and stood beside him. For a while neither of them said anything, which for one of them was normal. 5 fights, said Lugnuts at last. There was something in his voice that in a smaller creature would have been called wistfulness. You had 5 fights, da convoy, da armored wagon, dem grots what you chased up the cliff, da other bit of de convoy. He counted them on his claw. I had a mountain fall on me, and it helped. The flying one shot at you, Vroomtoof offered. Wunz. Lugnuts's vox grill made a sound, like gravel settling, which was his sigh. It missed me and fixed me tunnel. Even the gits what shoot at me is helpin' me. He looked out at the smoke on the western horizon, where the war was, where things happened to other orcs. You was the Fasta, he said. I was the first, but you had the better trip, and that's the truth. He reached up to his hull, unbolted the yellow Humi mine helmet with the little lamp, and held it out. It was, by the standards of a Deathskull parting with property, roughly equivalent to a Humi giving away a planet. Vroomtoof turned it over in his hands. Then he grinned, all his teeth at once, and bolted it to the Screama's roll cage, where it was extremely unaerodynamic, and where it would stay for the rest of that buggy's loud, brief life. Next time, Vroomtoof said, standing up, because he had already stopped losing and started planning. I brings 2 fuel tanks. 2 tanks is twice the fuel, what is twice the fast. And we goes round dio other woe, where the fights wars, and we sees who gets through the middle of a war quicker, your big blue anchor. Done, said Lugnuts, and they shook on it, claw to fist, and the bookies heard the word and began, joyfully, to scream. The party at the way station burned until dawn, and it was a good one, even by the standards of a speed war. And if anyone had climbed the water tower and looked west, back along the race, they'd have seen the whole day laid out in the dark, like a tally on a slate, the burnt-out convoy in the canyons, and the silent mine with its belt still running, carrying ore to a railhead where no train would ever come again, and the refugee road cratered under the patient stars, 40 kilometers of somebody's ending that 2 orcs and a grot with a slate would remember forever as one of the really good days. Whoa.